The hammering started before the snow melted. Not cautious work, not the kind of careful tapping that framed doors or laid shingles, but hard, fast, stubborn pounding. Folks in the valley paused, turned their ears uphill and muttered, "She's at it again." Because of course she was, that widow with the sour mouth and calloused palms, that woman who buried her husband without calling on a pastor, and then built the first floor of her home with no man watching. Now she was pounding again, and this time she was going up. They watched from the ridge trail, from the creek bed, from behind warped glass windows in their own drafty homes. First she framed a second floor atop the first, as any frontier family might, though it looked out of place, crooked like an afterthought. But then, days later, she hoisted new beams, not for a roof, for another floor, a third one, a final, narrow room on stilts, high above the rest, like a lookout tower or a crow's nest on a ship gone mad. And that's when the laughter began. They laughed at her in the post office, laughed outside church, laughed as they fed their hogs or hauled water through late snow. Because no widow on her own should be building skyward. Because who needed 3 floors to survive the winter? Because she wasn't right, wasn't normal, and because she didn't seem to care. But the widow, whose name was Louisa Cray, did not build for their approval. She built for a reason, and soon the reason would bury every man, woman, and child in that valley under ice, under silence, and under regret. Louisa hadn't always been strange, though she'd never been soft. Folks remembered her when she rode into the valley with Amos Cray, a farmer with a spine like barn timber and hair the color of rusted nails. Amos did the talking, the trading, the neighborly grinning. Louisa only nodded, hands always busy, sorting seeds, tying rope, mending canvas, stacking firewood. They said she never smiled until the day she gave birth to a still baby girl, and then buried the child behind their first homestead. After that, no one saw her laugh again, not even Amos. He died hauling frozen hay 2 winters later, chest cracked open by frost and lungs gone black by morning. Louisa buried him with the same spade she used to crack the well, alone. She stayed alone for 5 winters, built her cabin near a rock wall that caught the morning sun, added a window, dug her own root cellar, never once asked for help. She came down to town for salt, nails, flour, bought pipe tobacco even though she didn't smoke, never spoke of what she did in her home, never opened her door to others. So when she started building that second floor in spring of '81, the town was already primed to mock her. And when the third floor rose days later, a narrow, boxy little perch with too many windows and strange black slats in the walls, they didn't just mock her, they called her cursed. "Ain't no chimney in the world that can heat." 3 floors, said Tucker Mullin, who fancied himself an expert because he'd nearly burned down his own barn, trying to insulate it with horsehair and pine tar. "Heat rises, sure, but not that much. She's just making a wind tunnel," barked Mr. Longley, whose wife secretly visited Louisa once a month for herbs and quiet conversation. "She's gonna die up there, poor fool," muttered the shopkeep's boy. But Louisa didn't argue, didn't explain. She finished her third floor in silence, then spent 2 weeks lugging firewood up the stairs in great clattering bundles. Then came crates of packed soil and tar-sealed barrels, and something that smelled like creosote and vinegar. When the fall rains came, she worked in them anyway, wrapped in oiled canvas, hatless. And when the first frost hit the valley in early October, smoke curled from the chimney of her third floor, not the ground floor. That made the men go silent, for a time. Nobody knew exactly how she did it. There were rumors, of course, that she'd built narrow heat channels between the walls, that she'd buried iron stoves in every floor, that she'd hollowed out the stone behind the house and piped in geothermal warmth from the earth, that she'd lived with miners once, or studied with a doctor, or kept books in foreign languages no one had ever seen. But all anyone knew for certain was that the top of her cabin, this strange little perch above 2 other full floors, smoked steadily every morning and glowed with lamplight every night. Then November came, and with it the freeze. It wasn't a blizzard at first, just a deep, sudden cold, the kind that cracked fence posts and froze chamber pots by dawn. Cattle bellowed in the night. Ice spread in jagged veins down well ropes. Some men rode out for coal, others split wood from barns. One man tried to burn a stack of dry manure. Louisa Cray, meanwhile, stayed inside her 3-tiered home. From the trail, her windows burned. Bright amber, steam curled from a stovepipe that shouldn't have worked at that height. And strangest of all, she never came down. By the second week, the valley had turned desperate. Children's noses bled from the cold. Boots froze beside beds. Ink cracked inside inkwells. A family was found huddled in their cellar, having tried to light a fire with lamp oil. 2 of them never woke up. The laughter stopped, and the wondering began. 3 days before Christmas, with the cold deep enough to kill an ox left outdoors, Thomas Abel rode up toward Louisa's place with frost in his beard and tears crusted on his lashes. He was carrying his son wrapped in 3 blankets. The boy had stopped speaking that morning. His wife's hands were too frozen to carry him. Louisa answered her door before he knocked. "Third floor," she said, stepping aside. Thomas didn't argue, didn't ask. He climbed. Inside, the first floor felt warm. Not hot, but warm enough to loosen his jaw, make his knees wobble. The second floor was warmer still, humid somehow like a spring morning. But the third, he opened the narrow door, expecting an attic. Instead, he found a room full of light, a stove like nothing he'd seen, long and low and sealed tight. Black vents ran along the corners, humming faintly. The walls were paneled in something that shimmered, and heavy quilts hung from the rafters like sails. There were barrels, too, lined up neatly and labeled with strange markings. The boy stirred. For the first time in hours, he coughed. Louisa came in behind him and poured a cup of something thick and brown. "Molasses," she said, "with heated lard." Thomas looked down at the boy. The boy looked back, and then he cried, not from pain, just relief. They came slowly after that. 1 neighbor, then 2, then a mother with twins, then a hunter with frostbitten hands. Louisa took them in one by one, never turning anyone away. She'd built beds on the second floor, enough for 10, and the third she saved for the smallest, the weakest, the sick. The men who had laughed most now kept watch outside her home, bringing firewood, keeping the trails clear. They never asked what she'd done, how she built it, why it worked. All they knew was that somehow the top floor stayed 68 degrees warmer than the valley below. And when the thaw finally came in late February, when the snow turned to slush and the crows returned to the trees, Louisa Cray stepped outside and poured boiling water down her steps, not for ice, for cleansing. Not a single soul she'd taken in had died, not one, and not a single man laughed again at what a widow could build. By early March, most of the snow had sunk into mud. The creek groaned under a thick skin of black ice, and mules slipped along the trails like old men on whiskey legs. But life, thin and coughing, began to return to the valley, not with celebration, not with relief, but with the quiet, stunned rhythm of people, still alive when they shouldn't be. And central to all of it, unspoken but undeniable, was Louisa Cray's cabin. She never called it a miracle, never once acted as if her home had done anything more than it was meant to. But to those who had nearly frozen in their own beds, who had carried children half dead from cold, or whose fingers now bore the purpling kiss of frostbite, that towering 3-story cabin had been something holy. It changed how they looked at her. And not just her, but what she'd done, what she'd endured, what she knew that they didn't. They didn't say sorry, no one said that, but they brought things now. Bundles of dry moss for tinder, tins of salt pork, dried apples. One man left 2 new panes of glass without a note. A woman, Marjorie Lellan, who had once led the loudest laughs at the general store, knitted Louisa a thick pair of socks with crimson thread. She didn't hand them over in person, but she did leave them tucked in the split of Louisa's fence, knotted in twine like a prayer offering. Still, Louisa said nothing. She accepted the gifts with a nod or a glance, sometimes a muttered, "Thank you," but nothing more. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. She just went on living, fetching water, trimming logs, mending her stovepipes, carrying sacks up the narrow interior stairs, as if her back were made of ashwood and her lungs carved from flint. The third floor, though, that stayed closed. Visitors noticed that. Thomas Abel, who had been the first to cross her threshold that December night, was one of the few who'd seen the top floor more than once. His boy had slept up there during the worst weeks of the freeze, and he'd helped Louisa carry buckets of coals and reheat the clay barrels she used for thermal mass. But even he hadn't been upstairs since the thaw. When he asked her once, softly, if she planned to open it to others, maybe for visits or for help with new families, she'd only replied, "It's not meant for show." And that was that. But the questions remained. By mid-spring, speculation turned obsessive. It wasn't just that Louisa's home had stayed warm. It was that no one else's had. Cabins with stoves roared all winter, but froze inside. Barns collapsed from snowmelt, and horses died with icicles in their nostrils. Even the church, which had the tallest chimney in the valley, went dark for nearly 3 weeks in January. Yet Louisa's home stood bright, warm, safe. "I think it's the shape," said Elias Brenner, a carpenter with a missing thumb who now fancied himself a thermal engineer. "Heat's got nowhere to go but up in a straight stack like that." "No, it's those barrels," countered George Proul, a fur trapper who smelled like tannin and old pipe. She's got saltpeter or lime or some damn chemical trick in there. Makes heat, traps it. It's the wind, muttered Mrs. Leland, who had now taken to sitting near Louisa's trail each morning. That rock wall behind her house? It breaks the wind just right, keeps her cabin blanketed, and the most outlandish, from the blacksmith's apprentice, she's got wires running down to hot springs under the ground. Or she burns something in the walls, something ancient, but no one asked Louisa directly. Something about the way she stood on her porch now, quiet, still, with her hands folded beneath a black wool shawl, made her seem like part of the land, like a column of basalt that had been there for centuries, unmovable, unquestionable. You could wonder about a rock. You didn't interrogate it. There were others who didn't care about the mystery. A girl named Hannah moved in with her in early April, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and a torn bonnet. No one saw where she came from. She looked barely 16, with eyes too tired for her face and a limp in her left leg. She didn't speak much, but she worked alongside Louisa, stacking, stirring, fixing. Some assumed she was family. Others assumed she was hired. No one asked. Soon after, a man named Silas Witt came down from the North Ridge. He'd lost 2 fingers to frost and had nearly buried his dog alive just to keep his daughter warm. He arrived with a sack of rice, a broken sled, and his daughter slung over one shoulder. Louisa gave him the second floor. No explanation, no judgment. Others trickled in through spring, some to stay, some to help, none to gawk, and then summer came. The strange thing was this: Louisa didn't disassemble the top floor. That was what most assumed she'd do. In past years, men pulled their stoves to the porch by June and slept in cellars to escape the heat. But Louisa kept her 3rd floor sealed tight. Smoke still curled from the stovepipe on occasion. The windows stayed shuttered. When Elias Brenner, still determined to uncover her secrets, rode past in July and dared to ask what use heat was in summer, she didn't even look up from her digging. "You think next winter'll be kinder?" she said, voice like old leather. He didn't respond, just turned his horse and rode down, cheeks burning. By August, they started copying her. It began slowly. One man added a half-floor attic above his barn, then filled it with bricks and a cast-iron stove. Another tore out his chimney entirely and rebuilt it in segments, imitating the slanted stovepipe Louisa used. George Prull dug channels in his floor and filled them with clay. Mrs. Leland tried lining her walls with wet hay, though that ended poorly as the mold sickened her goats. But nothing worked quite the same. Even those who added second floors, hoping to mimic the stack effect, found their homes overheated in summer and still froze come October. Some grew resentful. "She ain't telling us something," muttered Tucker Mullin, voice thick with jealousy. "She knows a trick, something she's holding back. If she shared it, the whole town'd be better off," said others. One night, 2 men, half drunk and red-faced, tried sneaking around her cabin under cover of dark. They didn't make it far. The door to the 3rd floor had been reinforced with iron, and the windows were barred from inside. But what truly stopped them wasn't a lock. It was Louisa, standing in the dark, holding a shovel with a glinting spade. She didn't speak, just watched them, long enough that their breath frosted despite the summer warmth. They left. Neither returned. Then came the storm warnings. Late September, winds began curling strange from the west. Birds flew in crooked lines. Deer fled the ridges. Old miners came down from the hills early. The skies turned green, then yellow, then pale as bone. The air smelled of iron and mud. And on the last day of the month, snow fell. Heavy, wet, too soon. The valley wasn't ready. No one was. Crops unharvested, firewood uncut, roofs unpatched. The new imitation floors some had built twisted under the weight. And Louisa, she had been preparing since June. The barrels on her 3rd floor had been resealed, new stones added, quilts stitched, herbs dried. She and Hannah worked like a forge team, silent, swift, practiced. Silas built windbreaks. The little girl, now ruddy-cheeked and healthy, stacked wood until her arms ached. A second chimney appeared, narrower than the first, and most strangely, a row of small clay pots lined the windows, each with a copper coil inside, each glowing faintly at night. No one knew what they did, but they worked. When the second storm hit in early October, it dropped 4 feet of snow overnight, and for the first time in living memory, no one died in the valley. Louisa opened her 3rd floor again, this time not just for the desperate. She opened it for the old, the sick, the infants, those whose homes had cracked, whose chimneys collapsed. She rationed the heat, cycled people through, kept the lowest floor for storage, the second for sleep, the 3rd for survival. They lived like that for weeks. And when the snow finally lightened, though never fully stopped, Thomas Abel approached her once more. "We need to learn," he said, holding his cap in his hands. Not just from your roof or your walls, but from you. Louisa studied him, then looked away. Maybe, she said, you already have, and walked back inside. But not everyone was satisfied. Some still whispered, still watched, still waited. Because if one woman could survive where others failed, if she could build what they could not, if she could warm an entire valley from a cabin no wider than theirs, then what did that say about the rest? About what they'd missed? About what else she might be hiding? And what might happen if the next winter was worse? Winter didn't end. Not really. The snow kept falling past Christmas, then into February, then beyond what anyone in the valley could remember. It was not the blinding blizzard that killed all at once, but something slower, crueler, weeks where the sky remained a dull white blur, days where the sun never burned through, nights when windows froze shut from inside. Folks began calling it the hanging winter, not because of death, but because it lingered overhead like a rope from a tree waiting, and in that slow grind of time and cold, the valley changed. Cabins stood hunched like beasts too old to rise. Woodpiles turned to ghosts under thick snow caps. Even strong men like Silas Witt could no longer chop for hours. Frost clawed up from the axe handle, numbing him to the bone. The few families who still tried to stay independent took to sleeping in root cellars, burrowed with tarps and horse blankets. Children cried in silence, their faces wrapped in scarves. But Louisa's cabin glowed, not as a boast, not like a lighthouse, but steady, real, a promise. She rationed space on her second floor now like a steward on a lifeboat. Every night she walked from pallet to pallet, checking breath, touching foreheads, pouring warm broth laced with vinegar and dandelion root. Hannah, now sturdier and more confident, took to managing the coals and oils. The girl, Silas's daughter named Ruth, read aloud from the single book Louisa kept beside the stove, a worn Bible, pages mended with waxed linen and smoked at the edges. No one laughed anymore at the 3 stories, but not everyone was grateful. "They'll build statues of her if we let this keep up," spat Tucker Mollin one frozen morning, nursing a flask inside the abandoned livery barn. "Louisa the saint? Louisa the savior? As if she ain't just a woman with a trick stove and no husband." 3 men sat with him. Elias Brenner, face half swollen from an infected molar. George Prue, whose skin hung loose after a month of boiled potatoes and salt water. And a newcomer, a bearded man named Ransom Clay, who had wandered into the valley just after the second freeze, claiming to have lost everything in the Sawtooth Range. "She doesn't let anyone see what's upstairs anymore," Elias said bitterly, "except her little crew. What's she hiding?" George picked at a flake of dead skin near his knuckle. "You think she's got something unnatural up there?" "I think," said Ransom slowly, "that nobody builds a tower like that for no reason. That's not just heat she's hoarding, it's control." The word hung in the air like soot. Control. Ransom wasn't like the other men in the valley, where they were broken or thin or grey-eyed from hunger. He was alert, sharp-edged. He didn't speak much unless he wanted to be heard, and when he did, his voice had the kind of weight that pulled others in like rope through a pulley. He offered to help, cutting firewood for neighbors, fixing broken sled runners, even digging out old chimneys with nothing but an axe blade and rawhide gloves. But behind every favor there was a look, a silence. Question he never asked but planted like a seed. How long are you going to let one woman lead the valley? It took weeks, but it grew, especially when Louisa closed the 3rd floor again. It wasn't out of spite, it was necessity. Too many were coming now, people from outside the valley, from snowbound towns where roads had collapsed, rivers frozen. Some brought their children, others brought rifles, their eyes glassy with cold and desperation. Louisa turned none away from her property, but she couldn't let them all into the core of the cabin. She had supplies enough for 40 at most. Past that, people wouldn't survive. They'd all freeze together. So she sealed the 3rd floor with a thick plank door and iron hook, not locked, just barred. She told no one what was stored inside, only that it had to remain undisturbed. Even Hannah didn't question her, not aloud, but others noticed, and Ransom Clay took note. It was during the 3rd week of March that someone left a note on Louisa's fence. "Share what you know, or others will." There was no signature, no trail, just dark charcoal letters on a scrap of old muslin pinned with a blacksmith's nail. Hannah found it first. She tore it down before Louisa could see it, but it was too late. Silas spotted her burning it behind the woodpile. "Was it a threat?" he asked. "No," Hannah lied. "Just a prank." But Silas wasn't a fool. That night he sat awake on the 2nd floor with Ruth tucked against him, knife in hand. He didn't sleep. 2 nights later, someone tried the cellar door. They didn't get in. The root latch had been reinforced with an iron rod Louisa scrounged from the old rail bridge last spring. Whoever it was left only a broken stick, and a half-frozen boot print. But the message was clear. The valley had shifted. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was resentment. Why her? Why not me? And in the dark cracks between those questions, Ransom moved like smoke. He visited cabins by sleigh under moonlight, whispered in hallways, promised nothing but hinted at everything. He didn't say they should break into the third floor, but by April, 4 men had already volunteered to go talk to Louisa. She met them on her porch. No shovel this time, no gun, just a battered ledger book and her calm, burned paper stare. 3 things, she said before they even opened their mouths. 1, this cabin is mine. 2, anyone in need will be helped, but not at the cost of the others. And 3, she stepped forward, holding out the ledger. Every barrel, every ounce of coal, every sprig of sage, and every drop of whale oil I've used is accounted for here. If you think you can manage it better, you're welcome to build your own. She handed the book to Elias. He opened it, stared. Inside were dozens of pages, tidy, inked by hand, meticulous, notations of temperature, dates of burning, diagrams, elevation drawings, calculations of heat loss, even notes on how long it took a sealed barrel of Blackstone to radiate warmth through quilted walls. It wasn't just planning. It was knowledge. Elias closed it slowly, then handed it back. The others said nothing. Louisa returned inside. But they didn't stop, not all of them. Ransom had planted something they couldn't uproot, that doubt, that pride, the sickness that came from watching a woman succeed where men had failed, a sickness that turned to fear when, on the 1st of May, the snows returned again. Not heavy, not yet, but steady, flakes like feathers, slow and wet and clinging. The ice that had begun to melt turned black and slick. Root cellars refroze, wells cracked again. Another freeze, said the old miner who had seen 4 in his life. This one worse. Louisa moved faster than ever. She didn't sleep more than 2 hours a night. She and Hannah rotated shifts, boiling moss for insulation paste. Silas felled the last of the pine grove behind her cabin and split the wood by hand in a rage. Ruth kept the children occupied with quiet games in the stairwell, teaching them to count using dried beans and river stones. They knew it was coming, something bigger, a final test. And when it hit, when the storm finally bore down in the 2nd week of May, it was not with howling wind or blinding snow. It was with silence, the kind of cold that turned breath to powder and sound to glass, the kind that cracked logs from within before fire even touched them, the kind of cold that waited. Louisa knew that cold. She felt it through the floors, heard it in the way the 3rd chimney groaned under pressure, saw it in the animals, how they curled without sound, how the birds vanished overnight. It was time. She unbarred the 3rd floor, and that was when everything changed. She didn't open it to everyone, just the weakest, the newborn, the old, the ill. She climbed the stairs with her hand on the railing, eyes tight with pain. A bruise had begun, spreading on her ribs from carrying too many barrels alone. She ignored it. Inside the top floor, the heat was already building, not blazing, but deep, bone-soaking. From beneath the floorboards came the low thrum of warmth trapped for months, waiting. The barrels she'd sealed in summer with peat and thick oil radiated slowly. The copper coils in the walls caught it, spread it, and for the first time she let someone else see the mechanism. Silas, he stood in the doorway, silent. "It's not magic," she said, "just patience." He nodded once, didn't ask more. Others might have demanded to know. But he understood. Sometimes the greatest warmth is knowing where to stand and when to keep silent. And yet outside the cabin, the old poison boiled again. A rumor this time that Louisa's barrels didn't hold oil or stones, but something else. That she'd burned things not meant for burning. That she'd traded with mountain witches. That the warmth was unnatural, stolen. Ransom spread none of it directly, but he fanned the flames, quietly. And late one night, with the 3rd freeze turning cellars into graves, he knocked on Elias Brenner's door with a plan. "We open it, we see for ourselves, then we decide." No one noticed the missing shovel from outside the church. No one saw them slip up the ridge. But Hannah did not sleep that night, and when she saw a shadow move past the lower chimney, she woke Louisa with a whisper. "They're coming." Louisa rose slowly, not with panic, but purpose. She didn't bar the 3rd floor this time. She lit the lamp and waited. Let them come. The knock didn't come at the door. It came at the wall, 2 sharp raps of a blunt object against the logs on the side of the cabin, just beneath the 2nd-story window. Louisa didn't flinch. She stood in the 3rd floor doorway, lantern in hand, casting her shadow in a long diagonal across the staircase. The children were asleep. Hannah sat behind her, holding Ruth tight in a wool quilt. Silas waited just down the steps, axe across his lap, the head resting silent against his boot. A 3rd knock came, still not the door, this time from the cellar side, louder, more confident, metal on wood. "They're testing it," Louisa whispered, her voice almost lost under the hum of heat. "Seeing if we'll come to them." Silas rose, slow and quiet. "Should I go?" "No." Louisa set the lantern on the stair post and descended the steps herself. She didn't stop at the first floor. She didn't throw open the door or demand names. She opened a small slit in the back pantry wall, a tiny vent she'd carved months ago to check smoke direction and cold seeping in from the rock face behind her cabin. Through that slit she could see part of the back slope, snow 6 feet deep, the branches of the cedar trees warped with ice, and beyond that, 3 figures. Ransom Clay stood in the middle, his coat was turned inside. Out, dark side showing, and he held no weapon. To his left, Elias Brenner, carrying a long-handled hammer. To the right, a younger man, could have been a cousin of George Proulx, barely older than 20, but already sick with the frostbite swelling his knuckles. Louisa didn't open the vent. She didn't call out. She just waited. And then Ransom spoke, not toward her, but into the cold. "Louisa," he said, loud and clear enough for his voice to carry up the wall. "We don't mean harm, but we do mean truth." He turned slowly, scanning the silent walls of her home. "There are men and women dying in this valley. You've made yourself judge over who survives. That ain't just brave, that's dangerous." No answer. He continued, "We've watched long enough. We want to see it, want to know what's up there, what you're doing." Still silence. "Now you can open your doors and we'll come like neighbors, or you can shut us out and we'll come like frost." Louisa closed the vent. She walked back to the second floor, where Silas now stood in the middle of the sleeping room, breathing hard through his nose. His axe trembled slightly, not from fear. "They'll try it," he said, "if not tonight, soon. They'll try it tonight. They think you won't fight." "They're right." Silas looked at her sharply. "I don't mean to let them in," she clarified. "I mean I won't raise a hand, not unless they do first." "What if they force it?" Louisa studied the glowing pipe in the far wall, the low hum of coals trapped in her stonework. "Then they'll force the cold in with them," she said. "And that's what they don't understand. The cold isn't just outside." She made preparations. First, she opened the third floor wide. She lit every lantern, every heat barrel, every stove. The warmth gathered thickly, like stew bubbling over. She had Hannah strip the children to wool base layers, rub their chests with mustard oil, wrap their feet in lambskin. She had Silas lay wet cloths in a ring around the stairway, not to trap heat, but to catch footsteps. Then she left the first floor unlocked, not open, just ready. They came at 2 in the morning, not by the cellar, not by the front porch, but by the side window of the root room, where the wood had been warped since the first snowstorm in November. Ransom pried the shutter off with a crowbar, while Elias pushed a wedge under the sill. The young man crawled through first, slipping over Louisa's butter churn and knocking over a stack of cured hams with a crash that echoed like a bell. Louisa stood at the top of the stairs. Ransom entered last. The door creaked behind him as it closed. They stood in the first floor together, squinting at the warmth they expected but didn't feel. The fire was banked, the room dim, shelves lined with glass jars, none labeled, just shapes in amber and brine. "Up," Ransom whispered. He didn't shout, didn't ransack. He started climbing. Silas waited on the second floor. He stood just past the landing, hands lowered. No axe, no words. Ransom reached the step and saw him, and paused. "Where is it?" he asked. Silas didn't move. "This is where the heat's coming from, isn't it?" Ransom asked. "She's got a furnace up there, a forge, or a pump, or something. She's keeping it to herself." Silas finally spoke. "She's keeping it from the cold, not from you." Ransom gave him a strange look, a flicker of something sad, or maybe pity. "That's what people always say, until they freeze." Then he stepped past. Louisa didn't hide. She was waiting on the third floor, standing in the middle of the radiant heat like a figure out of a firelit sermon. The barrels around her steamed slightly, the floorboards humming under her feet. The coils in the walls glowed a dull orange. Ruth peeked from behind a curtain. Hannah stood near the stove, holding a basin of warm oil. Ransom stepped in and stopped. Elias came behind, breathing heavily. The young man tripped on the last stair and hit the floor with a hard thump, knocking over one of the lanterns. It rolled. Louisa caught it. Still, she said nothing. "This," Ransom whispered, looking around. "This is what you've been keeping." Louisa nodded once. "Yes," he paced. "You made this? The chambers, the barrels, the coiled metal? I built what I needed. Where did you learn it?" "My father was a glassmaker. My mother boiled tinctures. I watched." "You built it for yourself?" Louisa didn't answer. He turned to the barrels, touched one, winced. It was hot, almost dangerously so. The copper coils along the upper beams sang with low vibration. "You could heat the whole valley with this." "No," she said gently. "I can heat this room, that's all. The moment it spreads thinner, it dies, like butter on a blade." He stared at her. "You chose who lived. I chose who was closest when the cold came. That's not Fair? She finished. The word landed like a hammer, and then Ruth sneezed. All heads turned. Ransom saw her, a child, pale but alert, eyes glassy with sleep. He didn't move. Louisa stepped forward. She had fever lungs. The cold would have buried her. What would you have done, Ransom? He said nothing, just looked around once more, and then slowly, he reached down and lifted the fallen lantern, set it upright. He turned to Elias. She's not lying, he said softly. This isn't magic, it's discipline. Elias blinked. But she built it. You didn't. We didn't. He turned back to Louisa. I'm sorry. And then he left. Elias hesitated, then followed. The young man lingered, looked at Louisa, then Ruth, then the walls. He whispered, almost ashamed, will you show us how? Louisa looked at him for a long time, then nodded. By dawn, Ransom was gone. He left the valley without a word. Some said they saw him riding south. Others said he went into the high ridge alone. No one chased him, but the rumor changed. He didn't steal the warmth. He didn't burn the cabin down. He left it standing, and that changed everything. By early June, when the last of the ice melted from the upper trail, Louisa began teaching. She didn't do it from a pulpit, not with sermons or speeches, but every third day she opened the bottom floor and laid out tools, coils, stones, oil seals, clay barrel lids, and wool-laced vent tubes. She showed them how she built it, one family at a time. Not all listened, but enough did. The valley changed again, this time not from jealousy, but from fire, real fire. The spring thaw came late, slow, reluctant. It didn't wash in like a flood the way the old-timers remembered from easier years. It crawled in like a ghost. The snow didn't melt so much as thin. The creeks didn't rush. They murmured. Even the birds came back quieter, as if unsure whether to trust the sky. Grass grew in patches, as if cautious of revealing too much green too fast, lest winter snap its jaws shut again. But even so, it came, and as the valley exhaled, they began to build, not the old way, those simple square cabins, one stove, one flue, one floor, and maybe a root cellar if you had the strength and the time. Not anymore. Now they built vertical, slowly at first, then with momentum. First, one family added a second floor, mimicking Louisa's angled vent slits and stuffed stone insulation. Another dug channels through their cabin walls, running copper scavenged from busted stills or stripped telegraph lines. Others began fashioning crude thermal barrels of their own, using iron drum lids, sealed pine sap, and clay packed with horsehair. They traded fireproof quilt techniques like recipes, argued about airflow dynamics like farmers used to argue about corn yield. Louisa didn't lead. She didn't organize. She just taught, one family at a time. By July, 12 new 3-floor cabins had sprung up across the valley. They weren't as elegant as Louisa's. Most were crooked. Some leaned like drunkards. A few failed entirely, chimneys that backdrafted, or upper floors that never retained heat at all. But even the failures taught lessons. And in the slow rhythm of summer days and nail-hammered nights, the settlers learned more than thermal mass or vent spacing. They learned humility and interdependence. That was Louisa's greatest trick. Not the barrels or the pipes, but the truth she taught by example. No one survives alone anymore, even her. It was around this time that the letters began arriving. The first came by mule courier from Ash Hollow, a fur trading outpost 6 miles east and 2 valleys over. Handwritten, addressed to Louisa Cray, simply marked "The Tall Cabin." It said, "Word reached us of your home surviving 3 freezes. Our own settlers have suffered greatly. Please advise if you are willing to share your methods. We can offer goods in exchange: salt, bullets, flour." It was signed by 7 names. Louisa recognized none of them. The second letter came 2 days later, from farther west. This one had a military hand, block letters, stamped insignia from Fort Ransom. "We've been advised of your construction methods. If you have drawn plans, we request you share them with the Territorial Commission for Civil Preservation. Standardization of survival structures is vital." The third came from a trader named Banks, a man who had once tried to cheat her over a crate of barley. Now he asked to license her design, offered money, land, a percentage on future builds. He even sent a blueprint sketch with his own name etched at the top, though the drawing bore no resemblance to her cabin at all. Silas read the letter aloud, snorted, then spit into the fire. Louisa didn't reply to any of them, yet she knew what was coming. Not because she was clever, but because the world had a way of circling in on anything that worked, anything that survived, like wolves to firelight. That summer was filled with quiet visitations, travelers passing through, hunters with no meat, trappers with no pelts. They came with curious eyes, took long looks at the upper floors of homes, asked strange questions about ventilation. One man, thin as a whipcord with teeth too white for any local, offered Ruth a silver coin just to tell him what Louisa burned in her stove. Ruth took the coin, then bit it in half with her teeth and dropped both pieces into the fire. The man left before sunrise. By August, Fort Ransom sent someone in person, not a soldier, a woman. She arrived on a tall sorrel horse, with brass buckles and a saddle that hadn't seen mud, wore trousers and a high-necked jacket, eyes like glass. She introduced herself as Miss Helen Wainwright, representing the Western Civil Preservation Authority. She asked to speak with Louisa. Louisa met her by the edge of her firewood stack. I've read accounts, said Wainwright. Most say you devised a multi-floor thermal capture structure with seasonal heat retention. Quite remarkable. Your methods could... I'm not giving up my plans, Louisa said, not harshly, but flat. Wainwright blinked. I haven't asked for them yet. You came to. There was a pause. I came, said the woman, because what you've built here saved lives, and in the years to come, as winters worsen, others may not be so lucky. Louisa studied her face. You care about people? She asked. Yes, Wainwright said, a little too fast. Louisa tilted her head. Or you care about order? Wainwright stiffened. There's no difference if people freeze. Louisa looked past her, to the distant cabins climbing the hillsides. Some new, some patched together. Smoke curled from their makeshift summer stoves. Children dragged buckets. Mothers aired wool blankets on ropes. No, Louisa said. There is a difference. Wainwright didn't argue. Instead, she stayed. 3 days. She ate what Louisa gave her, hauled firewood, helped patch a vent chute, watched Ruth read aloud to a group of younger children one night while Hannah stirred soup, sat beside Silas while he boiled sap to seal a new barrel. She never asked again about plans, but on the third night she said, I see now why it worked. Louisa raised an eyebrow. It's not the cabin? It's the trust? You built 3 floors because you didn't expect help? I built 3 floors, Louisa said, because I expected to give it. They sat quiet a long time. At dawn, Wainwright packed. She left behind a journal. Blank, leather-bound, stitched by hand, no note. Just a small pressed flower inside the first page. It was wild columbine, rare, grown only near thawed rock faces. Louisa didn't speak of it, but she shelved the journal by her stove, and when the next child born in the valley came in October, a boy named Elias Jr., she gifted the book to his mother. The warmth didn't last. By early November, the frost returned. Not a freeze this time, not a storm, just that slow, creeping rot of temperature. Breath that stayed white in the lungs, ground too stiff to turn, wells that froze shallow. The third winter had begun, but this time the valley was ready. And they were not afraid. Every cabin had at least 2 floors. Half had 3. Every child could tell you how long a barrel of river rock held heat. Every woman knew to seal her ceilings with quilted canvas. Every man had a stove that vented in stages, not in single flues. Smoke rose in layers, heat stacked. Louisa's own home became less of a miracle and more of a model, and that was what she'd wanted all along, to be unnecessary. But of course, that's never how things stay. On the 3rd week of December, just before the solstice, a new group arrived. 7 men, 2 sleds, 1 wagon, and a machine, metal-bellied and sharp-edged, trundled behind them like a dead ox on wheels. They called it a heat regulator. It belched smoke and hissed steam and reeked of coal ash. They parked it in the middle of the field near the church, claiming it could heat 5 homes at once. They didn't ask permission. They posted signs. Territorial thermal distribution test, by order of authority. It didn't work. Not entirely. It heated 2 cabins, then belched sparks, then jammed. The men argued, blamed fuel, blamed the air, blamed the valley. One of them came to Louisa, not to apologize, to threaten. You'll need to vacate the 3rd floor, he said, eyes darting toward her vent stacks. It draws too much from the thermal balance, creates pressure. Louisa stared at him for a long moment. Leave, she said. He didn't move. She reached behind the door and pulled out the same shovel she'd held a year before, the iron edge still gleamed. Leave, she said again. This time he did. That night, someone set fire to one of the imitation cabins, not Louisa's, one built by the Lellans, humble, well-made, housing a newborn and an old miner. The fire started near the back vent. Oil poured under the wall. They put it out in time, but barely. The valley rose like smoke, and for the first time in its long, frozen history, it stood as one. They didn't run the arsonists out. They surrounded the machine instead, dismantled it, took every bolt, every coil, melted it down, and used the parts to build a new stove in the schoolhouse. One that would warm every child through the worst nights of January. One built with Louisa's hands, and Ruth's, and Hannah's, and Silas's, and 100 others who no longer laughed, no longer doubted, no longer believed that heat came from single fires, but from floors built together. The winter held. Through January and into February, it pressed against the valley like a hand on the throat, snow piled high enough to bury fence lines and blanketed chimneys until smoke curled sideways. Dogs refused to leave their lean-tos. Nails inside walls frosted at night. Leather cracked, skin cracked, even voices cracked, and yet not one soul in the valley died. Not that winter, because they'd learned. Each home had its own strategy now. Some borrowed Louisa's methods outright, stacked floors with coiled copper and sealed drums of volcanic stone. Others adapted, using what they had: ash-packed walls, repurposed coal oil lamps, sand layers beneath floorboards. A few built wind towers to pull cold upward and vent it before it reached the rooms. The designs varied, but the outcome did not. Warmth stayed where it was meant to. Babies slept through nights without coughing. Old men woke without bone pain. Woodpiles burned slower, smarter. Fires hissed, not roared. Each flame knew where to go, and for all of it, Louisa said nothing. She kept to her cabin, patching what needed patching, rising before dawn to check the smoke flow from each barrel, checking heat differentials with the back of her palm. She tended to the third floor less these days, spending more time teaching Ruth how to read the temperature by how the frost curled on the windows. But her presence lingered over every roofline, not as a queen or a preacher, as an architect of survival, which was precisely why her absence, when it came, struck like a hammer. She didn't disappear, but one morning, she didn't rise, not at dawn, not by mid-morning. Smoke still curled from her lowest flue, but none from the third floor. Hannah knocked and got no reply. Silas checked the cellar and found no sign of movement. Even Ruth, who'd never once raised her voice inside Louisa's walls, called her name with a rising note of panic. They found her curled on the second floor beneath a quilt, breath shallow, lips pale, skin hot. Word spread faster than wildfire. Louisa Cray was ill, not frostbite, not hunger, fever, the kind that made the eyes glass over and the joints swell tight as wagon bolts. Hannah took charge without needing to be asked. She mixed elderflower and hot lard, laid poultices on Louisa's chest, steamed wet rags over her nose. But nothing helped. For 3 days, she drifted, didn't speak. Her body remained warm, but her eyes stayed closed. Silas sat beside her each night, carving her initials into a scrap of firewood in long, slow loops. And outside, the valley waited, not just with prayers, but with fear, because if Louisa fell, so might everything they'd built. On the 4th day, a council formed. It wasn't called that, not officially, but 20 adults gathered inside the Leland home, now one of the warmest cabins in the valley thanks to its perfectly tuned venting system. They brought notes, ideas, some even brought tools. They discussed contingency plans. "If she dies," said Marjorie Leland softly, "we need to pass down her instructions." "We've already got the journals," said Thomas Abel. "Silas's daughter copied everyone. Ruth can recite them better than any of us." "But what about innovation?" asked another. "She was always changing things, adjusting." "We'll keep working," said Hannah, who'd left Louisa's side only to deliver the latest report. "She taught us how to think, not just what to build." Most nodded, but a few hesitated. "She was our shield," said old Mr. Brenner, who'd once laughed loudest at her 3 floors. "It's not the same without her standing at the front." "No," said Hannah, "but it's because she stood at the front that we can stand at all now." That night, Louisa's fever broke. Her breath deepened. Her fingers twitched. By dawn, her eyes opened. She didn't speak at first, just drank broth and stared at the beams above her head, watching the play of morning light flicker through the heat vent in the ceiling. But her silence wasn't empty. It was assessing, watching, noticing. By afternoon, she sat up. By dusk, she asked for her boots. And by nightfall, she stood on the porch of her cabin again, leaning against the post, while Hannah tried to shoo her back inside. The whole valley breathed out, and the second breath they drew back in was stronger. But while the valley celebrated, others watched. The roads had remained impassable for most of winter, but word traveled, faster than wagons, faster than hooves. They came in spring, not settlers, not soldiers, surveyors, then men in dark coats, and finally lawyers. The first arrived in April, while the last of the snow still clung to the ravines. He was young, with a trimmed beard and a city accent too polished for any mining camp. Said his name was Mr. Theodore Kent, and he came on behalf of a development firm called Horace and Redford Enterprises. He requested a meeting with Louisa. She granted it. They sat at her woodpile. Again, he laid out papers, maps, diagrams, letters. "We believe," he said, "that your thermal system has commercial viability beyond the valley. Mining towns, military outposts, even railway lodges could benefit." Louisa said nothing. "We'd like to license your design, full credit. You'd retain naming rights. You'd be compensated handsomely." Still nothing. Kent cleared his throat. "If you're worried about ownership, we've already filed a provisional claim with the Fort Ransom Patent Registry." Louisa's head tilted slightly. "They filed?" she asked, finally. Kent smiled. "It's a formality." "No," she said, "it's not." She stood, took one long look down the valley, where 10 smoke trails twisted into the evening sky. "You want to brand what saved these people?" He hesitated. "We want to share it." Louisa nodded, then walked inside, without another word. Kent stayed one more night. The next morning, someone painted "No" in tar across his wagon cover. He left at first light, but others came, some louder, some smarter. One even brought a priest, thinking Louisa could be reasoned with through scripture. She quoted back Psalm 127, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain." The priest said nothing after that, and yet the pressure mounted. A company cart, set up near the pass road, started drawing diagrams, took photographs, measured airflows in the newly built homes without asking, offered coins to children for details. One man tried to purchase Ruth's schoolbook copy of Louisa's diagrams. He left with a broken nose, not from Louisa, from Thomas Abel. They changed tactics. One evening, a package was delivered, wrapped in oilskin, no sender listed. Inside, a bound ledger, black leather, embossed with gold letters. The Louisa Standard, it was her design, word for word, page for page, redrawn and stylized, with footnotes, pricing charts, and options for mass production. It included her measurements, her vent angles, even drawings of her third floor. And at the bottom, in crisp print, "Property of H&R Enterprises." The valley erupted. "Thieves!" said Silas, barely containing himself. "They copied it," Hannah muttered, flipping through pages. "They filed it," Louisa said, quietly. She stood in the middle of her cabin, holding the book like it was something diseased. "They plan to sell it?" "Yes," Hannah said. "Everywhere," Silas cursed under his breath. "What do we do?" Louisa stared at the cover, then at the fire, then at the walls around her. The walls she'd laid with her own hands, the barrel seals she'd built when everyone else laughed, the coils, the stone, the warmth that came not from invention but intention. "They think the secret is in the drawing," she said. "It's not," she shook her head. "It's in the living, in the choosing, what to give, what to keep, what to burn." She set the book down, then turned to the door. "We're not going to fight them," she said. "We're going to outlast them." "How?" "Same way we survived the cold." The next day, she taught every child in the valley how to build a stove barrel from nothing but mud, moss, and sheep's wool. She wrote no notes, she drew no plans, she told stories, and by week's end, the story had spread to 5 more valleys, not through companies, through mothers, through whispers, through life. The winter broke like ice under a wagon wheel. No storm, no grand thaw, just a slow surrender, a hush. One day, the morning frost didn't reform around the barrels. The next, a snowdrift slumped and didn't rise again. Then the wind changed, not in speed, but in taste, less of death, more of soil. The children sensed it first. They stepped outside barefoot and didn't cry. Spring had come, quietly, and behind it 100 reckonings waited. Because winter had taught them how to live, but spring would teach them how to keep it. What had been born of desperation now had to become doctrine. The valley had survived not by chance, but by Louisa's stubborn invention and the discipline it inspired in others. But with survival came envy, with warmth came eyes from far-off towns. And now, with the world warming once more, the companies returned, not with machines or smoke this time, but lawyers and charm. They offered deals. One man offered to franchise her design under the name Cray Warm, a traveling builder's package with pre-cut copper tubing, stamped barrel lids, and instructional pamphlets. Another presented a printed catalogue, already halfway to completion, featuring the widow's miracle cabin next to portable outhouses and kerosene lanterns. "You'll be famous," he promised, "in every mining camp from here to Cheyenne." "I'm already known where it matters," Louisa answered and turned him away. But the valley heard the offers, and not all turned them down. Thomas Abel was the first to consider it, not because he wanted money, but because his cousin's family had died in the freeze 5 counties over. A company man from Denver offered to ship cabin kits there, using Louisa's design, or as close as we can manage, for only a modest licensing fee. "It's not greed," Thomas said one night, sitting across from Louisa beside her hearth. "It's guilt. We survived. Others didn't. Maybe this helps." Louisa stirred the fire with her iron poker. Maybe. You don't sound sure. She didn't answer right away. The coals shifted in the barrel stove behind her, their heat thick and steady, no longer miraculous, just familiar. Finally, she said, You ever see a seed grow wrong because the hand planting it rushed the job? Thomas frowned. Sometimes what saves you, Louisa said, can kill someone else if they don't understand it. But the valley had changed too much to keep it all contained. By summer, a man named Silas Morton arrived, claiming to be a carpenter, though his hands were too soft and his questions too precise. He visited every home with a notebook, never offering advice, just asking, Do you think your cabins stayed warm because of the height, or the wall stuffing, or the way it vented? When asked why he wanted to know, he smiled and said, Curiosity's the mother of invention. But Louisa knew vultures when she saw them, and this one had money behind him. The problem wasn't that people were learning, it was how they were learning. In the valley, children grew up knowing that heat had to be earned, that a cabin was not just shelter but stewardship. Every ember mattered, every quilt hung at the right angle, every floorboard sealed not just against wind but against complacency. Ruth once scolded a visitor for hanging their boots too close to the side barrel. You'll throw off the airflow, she said at 8 years old, as if it were scripture. But outsiders didn't see the discipline. They saw a trick, a shortcut, and as summer drew on, more came. Some stayed, some copied. One man built a 3-floor home in 6 days using sawmill scrap and cheap tar paper. Said he'd read Louisa's old journal, some copy that made it into circulation after one of the traders passed through. But on the first cold night of fall, his upper floor stayed as cold as the dirt outside. The wind moaned through every seam. He lit an oil fire. The house burned before morning. That was the first, not the last. Louisa watched it happen like a storm she couldn't stop. She didn't interfere, not directly, but when a young couple from a western canyon showed up at her door with soot in their hair and a newborn wrapped in thin cloth, she let them stay. She taught them how to pack clay properly, how to keep the warmth rising through silence, not just structure. And when they left, she gave them a bucket of river stones, not because they were magic, but because she had touched them, and that mattered more than schematics. The valley changed again that autumn. More cabins rose, but now so did questions. Do we let others come in? Do we let Louisa's design become law? Do we resist, or do we guide? It came to a head at the old schoolhouse, now the warmest structure in the valley thanks to the melted-down machine parts built into its vents. A meeting was held, not a trial, not a vote, just a reckoning. Louisa didn't call it. She didn't speak first. In fact, she sat in the back, arms crossed, silent as stone. Thomas stood. Everyone here has learned something because of her. We don't dispute that. But the question now is, do we keep it or do we share it? Silas stood next. It's already being shared, badly, wrongly, half-copied and half-understood. If we hoard it, it gets twisted. If we give it all away, it gets stolen. So maybe there's a third way, people murmured. What's the third way? Someone asked. We teach it, Silas said. Ourselves, with her, not for money, not for trade, but for survival. Eyes turned to Louisa. She said nothing for a long moment, then stood, walked slowly to the front. She looked out at faces, some old, some new, some that once laughed at her, others that cried into her quilts. She held up her hand and said 4 words. No plans, only people, then sat. That was the law. From then on, no written designs left the valley, but every person who stayed could learn. Every family willing to build with their hands could be taught. No schemes, no sales, just heat and the humility to hold it. Winter came again, earlier than expected, but the 3rd floors held, and this time the heat wasn't just warm, it was earned. By the 3rd year of warmth, the world took notice. Not just whispers in trading towns or curious letters from surveyors. Now it came in headlines. Now it came in wagons full of ink. Now it came with boots made from buffalo, hide polished too fine for any trail west of the Mississippi. Men who never held an axe stood in the valley, pointing at roofs they didn't build, taking notes on warmth they didn't feel. They called it Cray Valley in the newspapers, called her the widow engineer, never once got her permission. The first full article appeared in the Rocky Mountain Herald, written by a correspondent who never so much as stepped inside her home. It called her invention a miracle of domestic architecture, claimed she had pioneered vertical thermal theory and saved over 100 families from the worst freeze in frontier history. She learned about the piece a week after it published. A girl named Mercy, from the cabin by the stream, brought her a clipped copy wrapped in a corn husk. Louisa read it slowly by firelight, squinting at the small type. Then she folded it once and tossed it in the coals. The paper lied? Mercy asked. No, Louisa said. It just made it smaller than it was. The attention brought trouble, as always. By mid-October, a man named Clifton Wright appeared in the valley wearing a blue coat with silver buttons and an attitude that came from signing contracts, not splitting firewood. He didn't speak with anyone for the first 2 days. He just walked, measured, took notes, watched. Then he spoke to Louisa. If this valley intends to defy the territorial authority and establish its own method of building and heating without approval, the legal consequences will be swift. Louisa didn't offer tea. She didn't offer words. She just closed the door. Wright stood there a while. Then he walked back to his tent and wrote letters. No one knew where they went. But a week later, 2 armed riders arrived with satchels and sealed documents bearing the embossed seal of the Fort Ransom Office of Structural Standards. One of them nailed a letter to the post outside the schoolhouse. Notice of patent infringement investigation. It is the position of the Territorial Engineering Bureau that unauthorized replication, distribution, or teaching of unregistered thermal architectural designs constitutes a violation of the Industrial Rights Act, Revised Statute 1882. Effective immediately, all structures in the valley believed to employ the design known as the Cray method will be subject to review and potential dismantling if found non-compliant. Failure to comply will result in legal seizure of property and materials. The wind tore the paper sideways, but the threat held. The valley held a meeting that night. Same schoolhouse, same long benches, same breathless hush as the winter winds thickened again outside. But this time, Louisa didn't wait at the back. She stood in front from the beginning. Her spine was straighter than the year before, her hair more silver, her hands as steady as a loaded stove. "They want us afraid," she said, "so we don't build. They want us to feel ashamed." Hannah added, "For surviving." Thomas stood. "They want to take what they couldn't create." Silas grunted. "Let 'em come try." But others were quieter. "What if they take our homes?" Marjorie asked. "I got 2 floors and 4 barrels. They see it, they burn it." "They won't burn it," Louisa said. "You sure?" "No," she said. "But it won't stop me." She paused, then walked to the chalkboard and wrote one word. "Teach." "Let them chase diagrams," she said. "We'll teach with hands, with stories, with time. You can't patent trust. You can't seize knowledge that lives in the bones." The room fell silent. Then Ruth stood. She raised her hand. When Louisa nodded, the girl said, "We could leave." No one had spoken of it yet, not out loud, but everyone had felt it. "If they tear this place apart," Ruth continued, "we could go, carry the warmth somewhere else, show others." Louisa looked at her, long and quiet, then nodded. "But not yet." The review teams arrived 3 weeks later, 6 men in canvas coats. They arrived with sleds and clipboards. They came after a fresh snowfall, when the valley was calm and quiet, thinking to catch them off guard. But no cabin opened to them. No children talked. No one offered tea. The men wrote down what they could from the outside, counted floors, sketched roof lines, measured chimney widths. They stayed 5 days, never once stepped into warmth, and when they left, the frost seemed to deepen behind them. But the storm was not over. A month passed. Then, too, the snow rose. The 3rd floor of Louisa's cabin steamed nightly, venting clean and even, glowing from within like a lantern in a world turned black. Then, in early February, a rider came, alone. He wore no insignia, carried no warrant, just a letter, sealed in wax and marked in heavy script. To Louisa Cray, care of the warmest room in the valley. He gave no name, just handed it to her. She read it in silence by the 3rd floor stove, with Ruth curled beside her and Hannah across the room sewing a new vent curtain. When she finished, she folded it and sat still for a very long time. "What did it say?" Ruth asked. Louisa looked up, her face unreadable. "They want me to leave." Silas came up the stairs just then, carrying a stack of coals. "Who?" "The Bureau, or some man inside it. They won't say, but they're offering—" She trailed off. Ruth sat up. "What?" "A position. In Denver. A title. A salary. Architect of Resilience. They want me to help design new towns. Regulated warmth. Government certified." Silas barked a laugh. "They want to put you in a box." "They want to take credit," Hannah said. Louisa didn't answer. She stared into the fire. The silence pulsed. Then Ruth asked, "Will you go?" And Louisa said, "No," then more quietly, "But I'll send something." The next day, she took the old crate, the one with her father's tools, the hand-pulled planer, the dented compass, the glass thermometer she'd wrapped in flannel 3 winters ago. She packed it with care. She added a sealed barrel lid, signed inside, a brick of cured clay, a child's drawing of a triple-floor cabin with the sun beaming overhead, and a letter. 3 sentences. "You cannot standardize what lives. You cannot file a patent on wisdom. You cannot thaw a world by burning down the only places that stayed warm." She handed the crate to the same rider, and he vanished. No reply ever came. But the valley noticed, because that spring, for the first time, a stranger arrived, not asking to buy, or to claim, or to sell. He asked to learn. They called him Reverend Hale, not a preacher by any pulpit standard. His hands were too calloused, and his coat too patched. But he came with reverence, for warmth, for survival, for the story of a woman who built 3 floors when the world only gave her 1. He stayed a week, helped split wood, hauled water, shared in silence. Then he left. But before he went, he told Louisa, "I'm heading to a canyon 2 valleys west. Snow's worse there. Houses are old, but the mothers know how to listen. I'll teach what I can." Louisa asked nothing in return, only said, "Use what works, burn what doesn't." He nodded. That spring, 10 more came. Not to take, to learn. Not all stayed, but each took something real with them. Not a copy, not a blueprint. A story that the widow who built 3 floors didn't do it to rise above the others. She did it so the cold would have further to climb. The 4th winter came late, like a debt postponed but never forgiven. All through September, the valley held its breath. Skies clear, frost only lightly dusting the woodpiles. The sun lingered, suspiciously generous. Some dared to hope the cold had spent itself, that maybe the worst was behind them, that maybe they could harvest a second time, that maybe the fires wouldn't burn so hot or the walls so tight. Louisa didn't share the hope. She walked slower that fall, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched the frost lines creep higher on the ridges each morning. She noted the strange hush in the evenings, how even the birds stayed low. She watched the sky, and when the frost finally bit through on the first night of October, sharp as flint and deep enough to crack a barrel seal, she was already ready. So was the valley. But something else came that year. Not just cold, not just the bureau. The last floor Louisa Cray ever built had no walls, no roof, no chimney. It was laid into the side of a hill 2 miles beyond the ridgeline, below the tree line, where moss clung to shaded stone and the wind curled low like a whispered warning. There, among granite outcroppings and the bones of old elk, Louisa taught the valley what came next. It began with a circle, not a square, not a stack, just a ring of stones the height of a kneeling man, packed with soil and clay, open to the sky. No floorboards, no sealant, no vent pipes or copper coils. But when the cold came again, and it did, that 5th winter, smoke still rose from it. Warm smoke, contained, measured, and alive. The valley didn't understand it at first. They'd spent 4 winters mastering the logic of the 3-floor stovehouse, learning every vent channel, memorizing every seam. That shape had saved them. It was their hearth, their emblem, a symbol of resistance and resilience. Why change? But Louisa had always known survival wasn't about building one perfect thing. It was about learning to move forward before the cold does. So she taught them how to build with the land instead of atop it, how to sink heat into the earth instead of merely trapping it above, how to build with curved walls that spiraled inward to catch breath and ash and warmth, with thermal pits instead of floors, and thatched domes that could be lowered or lifted like lids on a boiling pot. She called it low heat. Others called it madness. But then came the 6th winter. No one called it madness after that, because the 6th winter broke records, not in snowfall, but in silence. The wind came hollow, deeper, longer. Men who'd lived through the past 4 storms said this one didn't scream. It watched. It moved like a predator circling the last fire in a dying town. In some valleys, stoves failed. In others, vents iced shut. In the flatland towns, 1 in every 6 cabins collapsed under cold they weren't meant to face. But in Louisa's valley, now called Cray Hollow, even on the newer maps, no one froze, not one, because half the cabins now had earth-dug cores and collapsible ceilings. Children slept curled in hollows where heat rose gently from hand-stoked pits below. Elders kept their joints supple, not near towering fires, but in tight stone nooks warmed by bodies and breath and layers of felt made from sheared sheep hair. Entire families survived on 2 logs a day. The cold walked past their homes and found nothing to kill. That winter, people came again. Not agents, not bureau men, not even builders, but wanderers. Grief-worn women with red hands and 2 thin scarves. Children with smoke in their hair and nothing else. They came not asking for knowledge. They came asking for warmth. And Louisa gave it, not through diagrams, not through blueprints, but through practice. She walked them into the circle, showed them how to pack clay with frost still inside it, how to feel for air leaks using just bare knuckles and silence, how to build a dome from birch and willow that didn't snap, even when the snow came fast. She taught them to build the way she had lived, humbly, completely, without apology or delay. And then, one spring, she stopped building. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The children taught now. Ruth, now nearly grown, passed lessons by song and story. Little Mercy hosted groups in her family's 2nd floor, holding up hand-drawn cutaways and testing chimney draft with dyed wool. Even old Silas sat with newcomers by the thawing creek bed, guiding hands through moss chinking and stone placement. Louisa watched and smiled. And then one day, she didn't come down from the 3rd floor. It wasn't dramatic. She died the way winter left, gently, steadily, with no need for attention. Hannah found her seated in the corner chair by the wide third-floor vent, eyes closed, mouth soft, hands folded on her lap like someone simply listening to the warmth hum up from the walls. She was buried the next day, no headstone, just a mound packed with the same clay she'd used to seal her first stove barrel, and a ring of stones around it, the kind that held heat when built right, the kind that didn't need to be tall. They held a fire that night, not a funeral, just a fire. Every family brought something they'd built because of her, an oil wick, a quilted vent plug, a child's clay model barrel, and placed it around the flame. Then Ruth stood and read from the only letter Louisa ever wrote to the whole valley. She'd left it in the ledger she never let out of her sight. It said, "Warmth is not a thing you own. It is not something you win. It is what you pass along when the cold comes. If I gave you anything, it was not a stove or a method or a third floor. It was a way to believe you could survive. Give that away freely, and nothing will ever freeze again." Years passed. The valley changed. Some cabins grew bigger, some grew smaller, some disappeared entirely as their families moved on to new ridgelines, new hills, new places where warmth hadn't reached yet. But everywhere they went, they built with the same spirit. Not tall, not proud, but right. And always, always, they built a third floor, even if it was only symbolic, even if it was just a shelf for firewood, or a space where a child could curl up above the cold. They built it not because they needed it, but because once a widow built something no one understood, and everyone survived. That's how she stayed alive. Not in blueprints, not in books, but in every place where warmth had no name, until someone gave it one.